Chinedu, you won't kill me in this house. I am your mother, and I'm telling you that I will not allow you to kill me. Mrs. Angole, in the usual Igbo women manner of expressing their frustration, screamed at him. The short, stout boy just stood there, glaring at his mom, who was chastising him for coming home late. What is it by your time? Do you not know that you belong somewhere? The mother continued, blocking the entrance door to the house, arms akimbo on her waist as he continued to hurl those creative words at him. You think you can just go out when you like and come back when you like, ba? But as much as those words were supposed to make sense to any right-thinking teenager, they meant nothing to Chinedu. He simply stood there, his eyes to the ground, his face wearing an expression that shows less concern, as he waited for his mother to finish shouting. It wouldn't be her first time anyway. Chinedu, an 18-year-old boy, had left home since afternoon without telling either his young siblings, Oluchi and Tochi, where he was headed. It was a recent habit that he had developed. Even after all the advice given to him by Mrs. Angole, he had continued to move about with less concern to his well-being and the care of those that love him. His mother had stopped whipping him with cane since he turned 15, part of the reason being that he has developed the boldness to trap the stick mid-air. Do you think you will enter this house that I, your mother, I pay the rent? Are you going to be sleeping in this same house with me? Mrs. Angole, looking at him, expecting some level of remorsefulness. But Chinedu neither flinched nor apologized. He simply stood there, eyes on the ground, hands folded across his chest. After the mother waited for a while without getting any sort of plea from him, you will not sleep in this house. Since you have grown too big that you can do something wrong in this house and not show any form of guilt about it, then you can't sleep in my house. She banged the door on his face, leaving him outside. Chinedu now sat by the door and rested on the wall of their house, never considering any form of apology whatsoever. Mrs. Angole, who had gone inside, went into her room and wept quietly. Tochi heard the mother sobbing and went inside to meet her. Mommy, it's okay. Please don't cry. He held her mom close and tried to pacify her. Why is your older brother like this? Did I offend God by having him? I treat him as good as any mother can treat their own child. But every time he keeps showing me actions that make me question God for allowing me and my husband to. She stopped herself from completing the statement. Her younger son, Tochi, even as wise as he is in a tender age, is not ready to handle that truth. It's okay, Mom. Edu will come around. I think he's just trying to feel among with these boys in the streets. Tochi continued to pacify his mom. Please, Mommy, let him come inside so that something doesn't happen to him outside. It's almost 9:30 p.m. Mrs. Angole, as a mother, was left with little to no choice. She was never going to leave him outside, but then she wished that a part of Chinedu could just feel sorry for once for things that he does wrong. It's alright, Nnam. You can go and open the door for him. When your daddy comes back weekend, I will discuss it more with him. Maybe Daddy will be able to talk some sense into him. Tochi sprang up from the sofa where he sat with the mother and made straight for the door. Mrs. Angole, now alone, wondered if there was any other way she and the husband could instill discipline in Chinedu. But the more ways she tries, the more wayward Chinedu continues to grow. Mrs. Angole got married to her husband 15 years ago. One of the promises that she and her husband made God was that they would extend a hand of gratitude by adopting a child into their home. That was how, 8 months after their marriage, they adopted Chinedu at the age of 18 months. A little over 2 years after, God blessed them with Tochi. The couple treated the two boys like blood siblings. With the arrival of Oluchi, the last born, the family lived together as one, and for over 12 years, none of the children knew they weren't entirely blood related. Now, as she lay on the bed pondering what to do with Chinedu, her heart continued to race against her pulse. It would be until Saturday that her husband comes home from work. For the remaining 3 days of the week, she will have to deal with her wayward son alone. She wondered if it was a mistake revealing to Chinedu that he was adopted. But it was a decision she and her husband arrived at years ago. They had agreed that if Chinedu at some point in his life will come to know that he was adopted, it is better, wise, and honorable for that knowledge to come from them. And so, at the eve of his 17th birthday, both parents called him into their room. "My son," Mr. Hyacinth began, "you know that you aren't much a kid anymore. And we believe that as you have continued to age, it is important to know certain things about our family." The man stopped for the wife to continue. "After our marriage 17 years ago, we made a promise to God, and you are that promise, my child," Mrs. Angole added. "What promise is that, Mom? And how am I it?" Chinedu asked, perplexed completely. "We promised God that we would extend a hand of gratitude to a motherless baby's home by adopting a child," Mrs. Angole replied. "Wait," Chinedu now puzzled. "Are you saying that Tochi is not my blood brother? Are you saying you are not my mother, real mother?" he asked, his face almost contorting to the revelation. "Only in the sense of birthing, my child," Mr. Hyacinth replied. "You see, a parent isn't necessarily the person that gave birth to a child. It has more to do with who raised and nurtured the baby. We accepted before God to take up the responsibility of nurturing and raising you as our own child, without any reservations. As far as we are concerned, we are your parents. We have loved and will continue to love you as our own," Mr. Hyacinth concluded. But Dad, why tell me?" he asked, seeming almost helpless. "Because you have the right to know. One way or the other, you will. You are a grown-up now, and you should know everything about your life," Mrs. Angole replied. "Now, Chinedu," Mr. Hyacinth spoke up again, "we trust that you are old enough to know the importance of keeping sensitive information to yourself. Your brother and sister doesn't need to know this. It's just between you and us. As a matter of fact, and most importantly, do not put it to heart." But as that night passed, and many more nights followed, Chinedu neither removed that revelation from his mind nor forgot about it. In fact, after that night, it was as if an unruly part of him has been stimulated, and he began to show some sort of stubbornness that continued to grow with time. The door creaked open and Tochi stepped outside. "Mom said you should come inside," the 14-year-old Tochi called on his older brother. "I thought she would not get tired," Chinedu muttered as he stood up to make for the door. "It's not fine what you are doing, Edu. Mom is really worried about you. You couldn't even say sorry for coming back late. And if I tell Mom where you went to, you'll be in big trouble. You know that." Tochi tried to caution his older brother. "And then what will happen?" Chinedu said, his nonchalance obvious even to the little boy. You can tell your mother, I don't care. Even if she doesn't want me to come inside the house, no problem. I will sleep outside here. But then, I won't be quite disturbed because... Then, he stopped himself. He was almost about to say too much, but realized that it wasn't necessary, revealing such unexpected information to his little brother. Tochi simply followed him inside. Just say sorry to mom and stop giving her reasons to worry about you. That's not going to happen, Chinedu replied and disappeared into the kitchen to look for dinner. Tochi simply left him to his decision and headed straight to his room to sleep. Deep inside, in his little wisdom, he knew his big brother is really changing for the worse. It was barely 6 o'clock in the morning when Oluchi walked into her mother's bedroom. Mom, good morning. Are we going to school today? Through the years of preparing for school early in the morning, Oluchi had grown accustomed to waking up early in the house, even on holidays. No, sweetheart, you are still on midterm break. Next week, Monday, you will resume school. Mrs. Angole, still drowsy, sat up from the bed. Now, call your brothers, let's have our morning prayers. Yes, Mom, Oluchi replied and ran out of the room. 5 minutes later, she returned with Tochi. Mommy, Edu said he will be joining us soon. Mrs. Angole felt same tinge of disappointment, but managed and brushed it aside. Oh yeah, let's go to the sitting room and do our prayers. 3 minutes to the end of the 15 minutes prayer, Chinedu joined them in the sitting room. Mrs. Angole had decided to not start the day with anger, considering the event of yesterday night. Should she try to address Chinedu's misdoing already this morning, it would only awaken the anger of yesterday, and so she simply ignored him. Tochi, you and your sister go and wash the plates from yesterday night. She began to assign the kids their tasks for the day. After that, you two pack out your dirty clothes that you will wash later when we are done with breakfast. Then she turned to Chinedu. Chinedu, go and prepare. We'll be going to market together to get food items. I'll prepare breakfast for us. Tochi and the little sister concluded washing the plates a little later and then joined their mother and Chinedu in the dining where they were having tea and bread for breakfast. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Angole and Chinedu were driving out of the compound. I do not appreciate you leaving the house without telling me, or at the very least, your brother, Mrs. Angole said to Chinedu from behind the wheels of the Toyota Camry. I'm not against you going to anywhere, at least places that are safe enough for you to visit, but someone has to know. Chinedu just sat on the passenger's front seat, listening. For once, it seemed a bit of him felt concerned about what his mother was saying, but nothing too serious to consider a remorse. At the very best, he just listened for listening's sake. I want you to start understanding that you have responsibilities over your brother and sister, Mrs. Angole continued. But if you continue to show this kind of character, what are you essentially teaching them? I want you to stop acting like you don't belong somewhere. You are my son, and I care and want you to be safe. I've heard, ma, Chinedu muttered, already tired of listening to Mrs. Angole say same thing over and over to him, day in, day out. For Chinedu, he feels he could do whatever he wants, given that she isn't his direct parent. A part of him unreasonably blames them for telling him the truth about his adoption. Also, given that he was beginning to connect with some other unruly boys in his streets who have no one questioning their whereabouts, he feels Mrs. Angole is subjecting him to unnecessary scrutiny. However, what Chinedu doesn't really understand was that whatever attention and caution from Mrs. Angole is for his own best interest. The drive to the market was a little over 20 minutes. The market was bustling with buyers and vendors as Mrs. Angole, closely followed by Chinedu, began buying the items they needed to stock the house. They had barely spent 10 minutes moving from one vendor to the other before Chinedu got a call from one of his guys. "Bro, how far? You never still reach my side. What's holding you now?" The voice on the other end of the phone inquired. "Calm down, bro. I'll be there," Chinedu answered as he casually stepped away from Mrs. Angole that was busy pricing some tubers of yam. "Yesterday was not funny based on the time I left your side. My auntie shouted as usual when I got back, but that one no mean anything. I would have come by now, but she took me to market with her. We are currently in the market now. Once we are back, I'll come over." "Baba, time dey go, try turn up on time. This guy go come with him system and him suppose show us how we go take handle clients." The voice hurried him and the call ended. "Who was that?" Mrs. Angole asked Chinedu as he returned to meet her paying for the 10 tubers of yam. "Oh, my classmate," he lied. "He wanted to inform me about a new place that we can attend jam lesson together." The unsuspecting Mrs. Angole didn't ask further questions. "Alright, pack these yams to the car. We are done here." Half an hour later, they were driving home. Later that afternoon, the cloud was gathering when Chinedu informed Mrs. Angole that he wants to go out. "Ma, I need to get something from a friend of mine." "Now?" she inquired. "Are you seeing the cloud?" She pointed to the sky, already laden with rain about to fall. "I know, ma, but I'll be back before the rain starts," Chinedu replied, playing down on the imminent rainfall. "I'm not sure I want you going outside with the sky about to pour," she told him. "Go back inside. Whatever it is that you need to get can wait till after the rain, or even tomorrow." This refusal by Mrs. Angole infuriated him, and he just kept standing at the corridor. Even worse, Chinedu didn't want to get anything from anyone. He actually was already behind on his appointment with the friend that he spoke with earlier. A guy that was teaching him and his friend internet fraud was to meet with them today, and as at 4 p.m., he was already 1 hour behind schedule. Mrs. Angole had left him at the corridor where he came to meet her seeking for permission. After denying his request, she entered the kitchen to access the food items they bought. Chinedu stood at the corridor considering the option of going back inside or outrightly disobeying. After a few minutes of thoughts, he stormed out of the house and headed towards the gate. Mrs. Angole, from inside the kitchen, heard the gate swing open and close. She knew that it was Chinedu leaving the compound against her instruction, as the pain of disappointment stabbed her heart once again. It would take him roughly 20 minutes walk to get to his destination. However, less than 7 minutes after he left the house, the cloud became darker. The cloud was so dark that even in the early hours of the evening, one could swear that it was already night. Yet, against all odds and on the grounds of stubbornness, he never reconsidered turning back. He had barely covered half the distance before the sky exploded with rain. First, it started drizzling, the type that assures you that this rain will likely fall. The type that tells you to quicken whatever you need to do. The type that spurs you to hasten up your pace or simply go into full running to your house. Had Chinedu paid any heed to numerous advice from Mrs. Angole, he would have sincerely turned around and gone back to the house, knowing that it was the better and safest option. But being that he had left the house in disobedience, he felt it would be shame to go back, and so he continued. Jogging now along the road, the rain seemed to be gathering momentum, and within seconds, the sky went into full downpour. Given, he could have continued in the rain to his destination, but it would mean that he'll be totally drenched by the time he arrives. Also, given that his phone is with him, he didn't want to expose it to rain, and so the next best option he had was to take shelter. He scanned for a convenient place, cleaning his face as the rain continued to blur his vision almost immediately. Eventually, he spotted a store made of wood and zinc roofing. It looked like a place where few market women selling fruits would gather and sell their goods. Without giving much thought to the safety of the structure, he dashed straight for it. Chinedu stood beneath the rickety wooden shed, his arms wrapped tightly around himself as he stared at the torrential rain battering the earth. The sky was a deep grey, heavy with unrelenting downpour, and the sound of raindrops hitting the rusted zinc of the shed was deafening. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, the ground around him muddy and slick. The air was damp and cold, biting into his skin as the wind howled through the market stalls, many of which had been abandoned by the traders hours earlier. A wise decision he too should have made minutes ago. "It will stop soon," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with impatience and a bit of regret. But the rain showed no sign of relenting. Instead, it grew heavier, each drop feeling like a small missile as it struck the ground. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Go back inside. Whatever it is that you need to get can wait till after the rain or tomorrow." But he had brushed her off with a dismissive wave and a muttered excuse. He had always been stubborn, convinced that his decisions were the right ones, no matter what Mrs. Angole tells him. Now, soaked to the bone and shivering, for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong somehow. The wooden shed groaned ominously under the weight of the pounding rain. Chinedu glanced up, noticing for the first time how frail and waterlogged the wooden beams had become. Almost immediately, one of the beams cracked with a loud sound, and panic surged through him. Without waiting to see what would happen, he darted out into the rain. The rain was blinding, a relentless curtain of water that made it almost impossible to see. Chinedu squinted, searching for another shelter, but his footing betrayed him. He had barely made 3 steps before his foot landed awkwardly on a loose stone. Before he could steady himself, he slipped, his arms flailing wildly as he fell into the swelling floodwaters that had taken over the streets. The cold hit him like a punch to the chest, stealing the air from his lungs. The water was a churning, violent force, dragging him along before he could regain his balance. He clawed at the surface, trying to keep his head above the water, but the current was too strong. The flood carried him mercilessly, tossing him like a volleyball in the court. His hands scraped against the jagged edges of submerged debris, broken wood, rusted metal, and sharp stones that left trails of pain on his skin. "Help!" he screamed, but it was too late. His voice drowned out by the roar of the flood. Water filled his mouth, his throat, choking him as he struggled to breathe. He coughed violently, his chest burning as he fought to expel the water that seemed determined to invade his lungs. Panic gripped him like a vice, and his limbs thrashed wildly, desperate to find something. anything to hold on to. He was swept into a narrow drainage channel where the current seemed even faster, the confined space amplifying its force. Chinedu's back slammed into the wall of the channel, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his body. His legs scraped against unseen objects beneath the surface, and he cried out in agony. The floodwater, dark and murky, carried all manner of debris: plastic bottles, broken glass, splintered wood, and each collision felt like a blow from a sledgehammer. As he was spun around, disoriented and gasping for air, memories began to flood his mind. He saw Mrs. Angole's face in the car, advising him to pay more heed to her advices. Then again in the corridor, telling him to go back inside until the weather clears. He remembered the countless times his stubbornness had caused trouble, the arguments with Mrs. Angole, the warnings he had ignored. Why didn't I listen? The thought was a scream in his mind, louder than the rush of water around him. He imagined her now, sitting at home, anxiously waiting for him to return. He knows she loves him, despite his troubles. Would she be worried, angry, or worse? Would she never see him again? Then he realized it. The words of her adopted father, a little over 1 year ago, clear and distinct as if it was last night. You see, a parent isn't necessarily the person that gave birth to a child. It has more to do with who raised and nurtured you. Another pain hit his chest. This time, not the weight of the flood or the debris that had been relentlessly smashing against every part of his body. No, this time, the pain of love from parents that cared and nurtured him over the years without reservation. Another wave of water crashed over him, forcing his head under. The world turned black as he was plunged beneath the surface. He fought with everything he had, his arms and legs frailing as he tried to break free from the water's grip. His fingers brushed against something solid, the edge of a concrete slab, but the force of the current pulled him away before he could grab hold. When he surfaced again, coughing and sputtering, his body felt heavier, weaker. The fight was draining out of him, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he considered letting go. But then, another image flashed before his eyes. Mrs. Angole's smile as she brushed his face when he was a child. Her laughter as she told him stories late into the night. He couldn't leave her like this. He couldn't let his story end here. No, he gasped, his voice hoarse and barely audible. Not like this. With renewed determination, Chinedu kicked his legs, trying to angle his body toward the edge of the drainage channel. The water fought him every step of the way, its icy grip pulling at his limbs. But he refused to give in. He reached out blindly, his fingers searching for anything to hold on to. They found an angled iron protruding out from the concrete wall. His hands closed around it, the cold metal biting into his skin as he held on with everything he had. The current tugged at him, threatening to rip him away, but he clung to the iron with desperate strength. Inch by inch, he pulled himself toward the edge, his muscles screaming in protest. The water roared around him, an unyielding force that seemed intent on dragging him under, but he fought against it, his will to survive seeming stronger than the flood. When he finally managed to haul himself out of the water, 1 kilometer away from his home, he collapsed onto the muddy ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. He lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. Every inch of him ached, his skin raw and bruised from the ordeal. But he was alive. Rain continued to pour, drenching him as he lay there, but he didn't care. He was too tired to move, too overwhelmed to do anything but breathe. Slowly, the weight of his emotions began to press down on him. The fear, the regrets, the guilt. Tears mixed with the rain on his face as he thought about Mrs. Angole, Tochi, and Oluchi. It then dawned on him that never for once throughout the ordeal did he think about his biological mother or his friend over the phone. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The love for a woman that had cared for her heavy in his heart. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll do better. I'll listen, I promise." The rain showed no sign of stopping. Then, in an instant, like a veil covering his face, he passed out. "Will he make it?" "Yes, madam. He will make it," the doctor in a white cloak replied, his confidence very clear. "It's been over 2 hours, doctor." Mrs. Angole, still worried, queried further. "The best and the most important part is that he was found. Thank God for the bus driver. Had he been left out there in the cold with the rain still that heavy, I'm not sure he'd have made it till morning. He sustained a lot of injuries to his body and a serious cut to his head, but they are mostly fleshy wounds. So for now, we keep doing what we can and give him all the medical attention that he needs. He will surely make it," the doctor concluded and left the ward. Chinedu's unconscious body was brought in a little over 20 minutes after he passed out. He was found by a bus driver under the rain. His phone was damaged, but his SIM card had Mrs. Angole's contact stored in it. 1 hour later, Mrs. Angole was in the hospital staring at his son as army of doctors and nurses were trying to stabilize him, thanks to the 500,000 naira that her husband had sent at once. Now, inside the private ward with long tubes and cables stretching from the back of the monitor to Chinedu's vitals, Mrs. Angole gazed over him with sadness and broken heart. Clasping his palms with hers, she prayed for his survival, both in mind and body. Despite all, he is still her son, because a mother's love knows no bound and is forever. Sometimes it may take the form of yells, flogging, or constant scolding, but no matter what form it takes, deep inside, it's love and care for her children. And no matter what we do or end up as, a mother's love will always be alive for us. Hopefully, we realize this early in our lives and embrace it for all our times. Thank you for watching. Till our next story. Bye.